Hello, everyone. I am Erika Barbosa from GreenGeeks. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, Easy WordPress Security, Protecting Your Home on the Web, with our guest speaker, Katy San. I think we are ready to start the webinar, so I'm going to introduce to Katy. Katy San has been working in web development with a security focus for 2 decades and currently works as a product marketing manager for Cadence WP, Iconic WP, and other brands as a part of Stellar WP. She has both technical and marketing experience and has worked with a number of brands in the WordPress space and has organized numerous WordCamps events, including WordCamp US. She's helped numerous organizations, both large and small, optimize their WordPress investments and recover from security incidents. And she is one of the executive producers of Open, a film about the WordPress community. Hi, Katy. Do you want to say hello and start your presentation?
Yeah, thanks for having me today, Erica. And it's nice to see you and nice to see everyone that's here. Very excited to get started. I guess I could just share my screen and get going.
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Okay, let's make sure we've got the screen is shared and my presentation's up there, and hopefully you can still see me hanging around in a corner around here somewhere. So
yes, like we can see you.
Okay, great. Awesome. Well, I will just dive right in and start talking about WordPress security and why we want to pay attention to WordPress security. Obviously, if you have a WordPress site, you are adding your content to your site. You are adding all sorts of images and photos, and maybe you even have a learning management system and you've got courses, or maybe you're selling things online using WordPress. The great thing about WordPress is you can do so many different things with it. And with that great power comes incredible responsibility. And that's what we're going to talk about today. But first, just a little bit more about me. I was building websites way before WordPress. I was also blogging and using a tool called Movable Type. But then WordPress came along and it was using sort of the same connection to databases that I was using. And it just seemed so much more intuitive to really separate design in a theme and content and put that into a database, well, with some other things. But when we were blogging back in the day, we would want to change the look and feel of our blog all the time. And so to have the theme in one place and the content in another, it just made management of the site so much easier. So I jumped into WordPress and never really looked back. A few years ago, I started helping people clean up hacked sites. My husband's site actually was the first site that I cleaned up. It was hacked during a vulnerability in a package called Tim Thumb. So I cleaned that up and it was fairly simple. I knew WordPress well enough that I could notice when something wasn't supposed to be there and just reinstalled some things just to make things clean and easy. But it got me really interested in WordPress security. Now, I had had security training before in my previous life before WordPress. I was involved in enterprise solutions and hosting websites and things like that. And so I got security training with that, inherited a server that got hacked and really kind of went into the deep end. So I knew the importance of security and I knew the importance of keeping a WordPress site protected. So I dove into it. What are some of the things that I saw? Well, I saw lots of different things. I cleaned I estimated at one point when somebody asked me, how many sites have you cleaned? I estimated it was probably over a couple of years, a couple thousand sites. Sometimes it was 30 sites in one cPanel. Sometimes it was a singular site. Sometimes it was a site that just had a staging server hosted in the same space. But I saw some things. And what I want to do here today is not necessarily, tell you all of my war stories, but I do have some stories and I would like to share some of those with you so that you can learn through some of the pain I saw other people going through and some of the pains I went through myself so that we can learn from these types of experiences and not have to go through them, not have to go through the pain of, oh my gosh, why is my site redirecting me to a bad part of the internet? By going through all of these experiences, we can understand how to protect our site. So first, let's take a look at why we even have to talk about this. If you have a site on the internet, whether it's WordPress, straight HTML, or Joomla, Drupal, any site whatsoever, if there's any kind of login form, it's under brute force attack. If you have a site that's hosted on a SaaS service, it's under attack. If you have an Instagram account, it's under attack. If you basically have any account online, it is going to be the victim of a brute force attack at some point or another. These attacks are kind of, I heard somebody say that it's kind of like the background radiation just of the internet, whether it's WordPress or not. Primarily, these attacks, when they're coming at WordPress, the ones that I've seen are attacking older vulnerabilities that have already been patched by developers, or they're brute force attacks. These are attacks that are just trying to use maybe a dictionary, a list of possible passwords, or passwords that have been discovered in a breach of some sort. And they're using these databases of possible passwords, and they just keep trying these on your WordPress site. iTheme Security blocks these kinds of brute force attempts, and they measure how many attempts that they are seeing. And just in the last week, my friends at iTheme Security, who is also a part of the Stellar Brands, they blocked over 335,000 IP addresses attempting to log into the WordPress sites that they protect just in the last week alone. Now, does this mean that there's 335,000 attackers going after WordPress? Not necessarily. Obviously, once a hosting provider starts seeing attacks coming at WordPress from a singular IP address, and it's like a flood of attacks coming at WordPress, hosting providers like GreenGeeks will notice this, and they'll put a stop to that IP address. So these IP addresses get kind of rotated around, but it just kind of shows you the magnitude of attacks just trying to log into your site. Now, is it a hacker just sitting in the basement trying to attack your site? Not really, but it might be a hacker who's written a script and put it on 300,000 or 30,000 different IP addresses and trying to log into sites that way. It's not just a bad guy, it's a bad guy with an army of bots. So it is a systematic approach that they're taking in order to get into sites. That means that we can take a systematic approach in order to block these types of attacks. Why is WordPress getting attacked? This is important to understand because a lot of people say, well, it's just a cat blog. Why would anybody want to attack my cat blog? There's nothing there. It's just pictures of my favorite cats. Well, WordPress powers over 40% of the internet. WordPress is the biggest player in terms of content management systems that are out there, and hackers understand economies of scale. Now, a hacker could try to spend all of his resources to try to get into one of the WordPress sites that the New York Times is using, because the New York Times does use WordPress as well. They might be trying to get into one of their sites, but the New York Times has how many people defending that? They have all kinds of firewalls. They have all kinds of protections in place. They might have a security operations team that's going over log files, looking for possible vulnerability attacks at all times. They know Sally's cat blog does not have that kind of resource. They know that there are hundreds, maybe thousands of cat blogs out there. They know there are tons of smaller businesses much like yours, that are using WordPress, but might not have the resources to protect it. So instead of turning their attention towards the New York Times, they're going to turn their attention towards hundreds or even thousands of WordPress sites that don't have security, because they're going to understand that economy of scale and have the bigger bang for their buck going after those smaller sites and doing damage to them, putting malicious redirects or spam links, things like that there, and trying to have an impact on their whatever their motivation is, whether it's their spam business or SEO business, whatever they're trying to do. So they assume you don't have less security, but we're going to thwart them. We're going to have just as much security because we are going to make intelligent decisions about securing our sites. Why are they trying to do this? There are numerous reasons. They might try to just deface your site for fun. They might be trying to add spam links into your posts or pages. They might be trying to put a malicious mailer to send spam out to email addresses. They might be trying to set up a phishing kit hidden somewhere on your site and then emailing people and directing that so that they can capture other people's passwords. They might be trying to just put a JavaScript line into some of your files or your posts and redirect people to a malicious website that infects their computers. Crypto mining is something that we've seen in the past. Really, what it all boils down to is a profit motive. They're trying to make money off of your resources, off of your site, either by taking advantage of your site's good reputation with the search engine results, or they're trying to take advantage of the resources of your server. But what we're going to do today is we are going to thwart all of that. We're going to take a look at the security landscape, some of the things I've seen, and some 4 key ways that you can stay safe. So the first Jedi trick to thwart the dark forces is going to be using unique passwords everywhere. Now, if you go to a website called Have I Been Pwned, it's haveibeenpwned.com, you can put your email address in there. I put in one of my email addresses, and this is an older screenshot. It says that I'm only on 2 breached sites. I'm sure I'm on more. I've used this email address for, years and years, and I've used it on sites that have had intrusions, and they have taken the customer data off of these sites, and it is now on the dark web and floating around in these databases that hackers use. This is something to monitor for your site, monitoring also not just your email address, but monitor your passwords. Make sure that your passwords are not being reused. Monitoring your security profile helps you make better decisions for your sites across the board. Reusing passwords is terrible because it ends up in a breach. So if you have a password that you've used on multiple sites, let's say, for example, you wanted to buy a pair of shoes, but it's only available on the smaller site, and you really want those shoes. So you log in, you create an account, they ask you to create a password. And so you're busy and you just use the same password you've been using for a long time. Maybe you're using your dog's name, 123 or something like that. And then that smaller site doesn't have good security. Someone gets in there and they get your password. Even if it's stored encrypted, they can still decrypt things. And then it ends up in these databases, and they ends up in as a reused password in one of these databases. And we see brute forces attacks. So some of the horror stories of what I've seen. Now, Jetpack is a very useful tool that many sites use in order to for security, for analytics, all sorts of things. It's also very useful to connect that Jetpack plugin on your self-hosted WordPress site, connect that to a WordPress.com account, because it gives you additional resources, additional statistics, those kinds of fun things. One thing that we saw when we were cleaning hack sites was that sites were getting hacked, but all of the plugins were updated. We didn't see anything in the log files showing that people had logged in, but all of a sudden this plugin was installed. And this plugin had malicious files in it, and it wasn't apparent where this plugin had come from. What we found out later is that the reused password wasn't on the WordPress site. The reused password was on WordPress.com. And so hackers were targeting accounts on WordPress.com, logging in there, taking a zip file containing malicious files and installing it on the self-hosted WordPress site that was hosted elsewhere. And people who had pristine sites were getting infected because of a connected account that had a reused password. So that's one horror story, and it just basically tells you reuse a unique password everywhere. Another thing that you might want to consider doing is not using the same domain name as you would be using for your WordPress site. So my WordPress site is Zant.com. I use Kathy at Zant.com in a number of different places, but I don't use Kathy at Zant.com to log into my WordPress site. So if people try to log in with that, say they discover my password, it's I have a really long password. Don't even try it. I think I also have two-factor authentication on there. So if you're a hacker watching this, good luck to you. But people would try to find out if they saw in a breach Kathy at Zant.com and a password associated with that, they would go try that on Zant.com, for example. I worked on a specific incident response where that had happened. It wasn't my site, it was somebody else's, where they had the email address and the domain name associated with the site and a reused password. And so they just went and tried it on that site. So it was like, James at Jane.com, and they went to Jane.com, tried James at Jane.com, and the password that they had found, tried it there, and they were able to log in and do a lot of damage because they basically took over the site. These breaches continue to happen until we get to the point where we have more advanced logins available to us, and that's coming. But for where we are right now in terms of security, you have to be using unique passwords everywhere, and you have to be using two-factor authentication everywhere that you can. There are a number of plugins that do this. iTheme Security is a great plugin that has this available in it. I highly recommend using that. What is two-factor authentication? Well, basically, your username and your password are two things that you provide a site to tell them who you are. Two-factor authentication is another token or another variable that you need to provide a system in order to log in. I would recommend two-factor authentication, not just for WordPress, but everywhere. And I highly recommend using Authenticator app to do this. And I have a horror story that I can share with you to tell you why. And you can Google the story. I highly recommend reading it. It is a major eye opener. It's on medium.com. You can just Google the most expensive lesson of my life, details of a SIM port hack. And this basically walks through a timeline of a SIM port attack that basically allowed a hacker to get into someone's Gmail account by basically taking over their cell phone. And that Gmail account was connected to their cryptocurrency account, and they lost more than $100,000 because they were the victim of a SIM porting attack. Really important to keep your devices secure, but also very important to use something other than SMS for your two-factor authentication. It's a fascinating story, and it also is a good story to read just to understand the psychology of what happens in a hack so that you can sort of attune yourself into those initial warning signs that something might not be right with your banking account, your WordPress site, whatever, so that you're more attuned to investigate quickly rather than, as this gentleman did, took a look at his phone, noticed it wasn't connecting properly, and just said, I'll look at that in the morning, went to sleep. And in that time frame, he was a victim of an attack. All right. So an escalated breach. This was another one where a reused password and no two-factor authentication basically allowed a hacker to get into a system, basically take over a WP admin, but also because that server wasn't patched and because of how it was hosted, was able to escalate that small intrusion just into the WordPress site, which is bad enough, but escalate into a network solution or into a network scenario, and basically got off of that server and got into other systems because of how things were hosted. So this escalated breach was horrific, but it started with just a reused password. So you might think, well, they get into WP admin, no big deal. I'll just go clean it up, or I'll just restore from a backup, something like that. But it's really important that you realize that one small intrusion can turn into something much larger, depending on how you have things set up. You want to set up your security so that you have as many hurdles for a hacker to go through. The unfortunate thing is that hackers are pretty persistent and like to experiment and test and try things. So you have to really make sure that all of those hurdles are well secured. So the Jedi trick here is functional isolation. This means basically you have a WordPress website. It is doing, maybe one thing. Maybe it is WooCommerce. And let's say you want to also have a course that you're going to launch. Do you want to install LearnDash, for example, into that same environment? I would argue that you would want to set up a separate WordPress installation, have one for WooCommerce, and isolate it away from things like LearnDash or things like your accounting system, like this one, like that previous escalated breach showed us. You want to make sure that you have a function for each particular WordPress website, commerce in one spot, maybe your blog in another spot, although, the blog is not quite as sensitive as, say, WooCommerce, where you have customer information stored. LearnDash maybe in a different place altogether. But if you isolate all of these and you also host them in a place where they are functionally isolated, that is important as well. And here's a reason why. All right, so the site cleaning customer comes in, and we've got a singular site that they're requesting us to clean. And I take a look at the site, and it's hosted in a cPanel with 30 other sites. And I start poking around, and yeah, every single site within that cPanel was infected with the same malware. And all 30 of these sites were redirecting to a bad part of the internet. So it was an agency client, and the agency was basically hosting all of these sites for their client, and all of his clients were being redirected. So it was a pretty easy and clean, because it was the same basically JavaScript that was appended to every single JavaScript file in every single site, but it affected each and every one of this agency's customers. And so for this customer, the agency, it was a big deal. How did it happen? It was a reused password on one site where he had given WP admin administrator access to one of his clients. They were using a reused password, we think, and somebody was able to use that login, basically go to edit the theme files and went to the 404 page and put a backdoor there. And using that backdoor was able to basically say, find me every JavaScript file I have access to and append this redirect to it. And it affected 30 sites. Why? Because when you have a cPanel, all of those sites are using the same permissions, using the same server-based user. So site number 1 and site number 28 and all of them in between, and therefore are all using the same permissions. So the one site that was affected by the reused password also had the same access across the board. So just compromising that one site meant the entire hosting account was compromised. So you want to make sure that each of your sites, if you're using cPanel, one site, one cPanel, if you're using another type of management system, just double check to make sure that each of your sites are running in functional isolation so that each one of them is using a different server-based user. This isn't the WP admin user. This is a user that's running within Linux, and you want to make sure that each site is using their own user so that PHP, so if that one site, if he had done it and set it up that way, then that one site would have been infected. That's a different cleanup process than cleaning up 30 sites altogether. So really important for you to functionally isolate all of your sites. Also, again, we're back to credentials, making sure that your sites are not vulnerable to these brute force or reused password issues, putting two-factor authentication on every single account that you can use. And then the principle of least privilege is a principle within the security space. And this principle of least privilege is basically, do you need to give access to everything for everyone? Or did this agency's customer who needed to just basically edit content, maybe add a post here and there, they didn't need theme access? Obviously, because the agency was doing all of that, giving them a lower privileged account so that they could still post content and change some verbiage, but they didn't have access to everything. So by degrading the access for accounts that don't need admin access, it would have saved problems. Another thing that can be done in situations like this, and if your site's live and isn't in active development, I highly recommend doing this. Limit the editing access to the site, and you can go to your WP config file. Make a backup before you make any changes, of course. And if you add this line of code, the define disallow file edit true, if you just add that to your WP config file, that takes away that file editing capability. It's just another way of hardening WordPress. And if you do a Google search that says, harden WordPress, it will take you, one of the first results is a page on WordPress.org that basically gives you a number of ways that you can harden your WordPress installation so that you tighten things up. And when a hacker gets in there, they see many different hurdles to getting what they want done on your site in terms of any kind of problems that they want to cause. They can't do it because you have disallowed access to a number of different things. Again, we're just trying to set up as many roadblocks as possible so that they can't create the damage that they want to do. Our next trick is a layered security approach. So we've talked a lot about securing passwords, and that's incredibly important, but it's not necessarily enough. That's just one factor here. We want to make it hard for hackers every step along the way. That includes putting up ways to detect intrusions, get alerted to problems as quickly as possible, blocking those common attacks. I highly recommend using Cloudflare is just such a godsend. They have free accounts that work really well, and it not only protects against a lot of really super common attacks, but Cloudflare also acts as a content delivery network so that people who are accessing your site, like if you have a site hosted with GreenGeeks here in the United States on a server here in the United States, and someone's accessing it from the other side of the world, say maybe even Australia or South Africa, Cloudflare acts as a content delivery network. So it makes your site look much faster to them. And it has that additional security. Again, another hurdle for a hacker to jump. Malware scanning. Make sure that your hosting provider like GreenGeeks is helping out with, letting you know if there is any kind of malware on the server that maybe you haven't detected. iTheme Security is a wonderful tool for letting you know when you might have a vulnerability or if you have plugins that need to be updated. Basically, if you're using good passwords, if you're using two-factor authentication, and you know when something needs to be updated, you're pretty much going to be okay with WordPress security. WordPress security has come a very long way, but you definitely want to use as many layers as possible. You want to assume that something's going to go wrong anywhere and everywhere. You want to make sure that your site is saving log files. And I would even argue that you would want to take your log files that are on your server and back them up off of the server, much like you should back up your site off of the server as well. And you should do backups for the time frame and the cadence of whatever makes sense for you. If you're doing commerce and there's customers coming in all the time, you're going to want to back up fairly frequently because you want to make sure you're backing up all of the changes that are happening in the database when a customer is creating a new order. If it's a blog and it's only being updated once a week, maybe you only need a backup every once a week. But if you back up everything as frequently as possible, keep those backups off the server, and again, go through all of the steps to harden WordPress, you're going to be okay. I mean, security is not something that you need to be scared about. So just to sort of summarize what we've gone over here, again, unique passwords everywhere, use two-factor authentication. For now, I mean, in the future, we're going to have new login security methods that are going to help us secure our sites much better. These things like WebAuthn are going to basically make it easy for us to log in without using a password, using tokens and keys, pass keys. We're starting to see some larger companies do this, and iTheme Security is adding this to the pro version of iTheme Security very soon. So we'll start seeing this happening available to WordPress sites. Make sure your sites are functionally isolated, one cPanel for every single account, or one hosting account for every single site that you have. So you're not lumping them all together, which works. And I've had some debates with some agencies who do this, and they're like, but I've been doing this and everything's fine. Everything's fine now. If you're going to do it, make sure you're conscious of the risks of doing it and watch those eggs in those baskets very carefully. You'll want to make sure that you take that layered security approach as well, and just assume at every step of your website it is at risk. Everything from email to your customers' data. Make sure that everything is protected, and never, when I first got into technology and first got into web development, I assumed everybody knew more about security than I did. And it was an erroneous belief. I inherited the server from very technical people who knew exactly what they were doing, and I trusted that it was set up properly, but there were a number of things that were not secured, and it eventually got hacked, luckily by a white hat hacker who basically left a note at the root of the website saying you've been hacked. Didn't do any damage to the site, didn't cause any problems to that server. But it was a huge wake-up call for me to never assume that someone knows more about security than I do, to make sure that I take ownership of not only website security, but my security across the board, the security of my social media accounts, the security of my email account, the security of my banking accounts. Everything needs to be addressed with the highest, utmost security as possible. Because security really boils down to all of our responsibility. You can't blame it on someone else when you're reusing a password. You can't blame it on someone else when your site gets hacked. It's really important, if you do have an intrusion, that you back up everything right away and start really looking at what the intrusion vector, how did that hacker get in, and take responsibility for it. You can obviously hire a professional to help you clean that up, but really take some interest and responsibility for what occurred there, because it's a learning process. The one thing that I've noticed about security is that you can't just trust, a plugin that's going to secure your site for you. You can't trust your hosting provider that's going to secure your site for you. It's your site. It's your home on the web, and this security is your responsibility. Lean on your hosting provider, lean on the plugin providers, lean on other experts in order to understand what the landscape truly looks like. But the responsibility for your security and the security of all of your digital assets really rests with you. And it's not necessarily, it's not that complicated. It's just paying attention. And all of these tools and all of these experts are just here to help you make good decisions. It's really what it boils down to. WordPress security is not necessarily about WordPress. It's about you, the WordPress user. So that's what I've got for you. Keep in touch with me. My socials, I'm just Kathy Zant everywhere. I'm really easy to remember. Follow me on Twitter. That's where I crack jokes. I told Twitter I'm a comedian, but they said that I wasn't that funny. But keep in touch with me. I do have a mailing list. I talk about WordPress a lot, but I also talk about a lot of other things. So I'd love for you to follow me. And if we have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Kathy, for sharing your tips today with us. I have a couple of questions. How long does that take to clean a site that is infected? How long? In weeks, months?
Yeah, it doesn't really take that long. I mean, the biggest thing to do, if you have a backup, it's great. It's super easy. If you have a recent backup and you can tell, I mean, it's really important to know when your site was hacked. if you have backups and let's say your site was hacked 3 days ago and you restore from a backup from 6 hours ago, it's probably going to have the infection in it. So it's really important to have, at least 30 days of backups and to pay attention to your log files, pay attention to, any kind of alerting system that you have, whatever plugin that you use, that something may be wrong. Google is great for this. If you have your site hooked up to Search Console, it'll tell you if there's a problem. I've seen a lot of Search Console sites actually, or accounts, be hacked as well, because hackers will get in and want to get into sitemaps and things like that, and basically use your site for improving their site's SEO by doing backlinking and things like that. So they'll get into the Search Console account. But Google is, I think, one of the first alarm bells that you'll see is that there's a problem with your Search Console. So if you're not using Search Console yet to kind of monitor your site, not only in terms of how you are ranking in the search engines, but also security alerts, I would say definitely make sure that you're using that. But cleaning up a hacked site, the fastest one I ever did was in an hour. It was a smaller site and it was a very minor infection. And that 30 sites in a cPanel, that took me 12 hours of really focused time. And it was just, one particular line in a JavaScript file. The most difficult part of that was, okay, which one of these sites was the intrusion vector? Which one of these sites had the problem? And basically trying to find that out. That took the longest time for that, but actually just cleaning the site was pretty easy because it was just kind of like a giant global search and replace. And I don't know, it was like gigabytes of files. Some sites are huge and they can take a lot longer. Some infections are very persistent, and it also depends on what all has been. Was the cPanel account compromised? The entire hosting account compromised? That can take a lot longer. But so it can go from like an hour or two, or it can take. The longest one I worked on was a week, and that was a giant site that was like load balanced, and it was in the news. It was kind of a big nonsense, very monster hack, and that took a lot of investigation to figure it out.
Thank you, Kathy. I was curious about how long to take clean the website. We have questions in the Q&A. I don't know if you want to read them. Oh.
Yeah, how best to keep track of all the unique passwords. Yeah, that's a good question. I really highly recommend using a password manager. And there's a number of them that are really good. I really like 1Password because it is integrated with Have I Been Pwned? And so it'll tell you, hey, this password has been used in a breach. Maybe you need to, so it has this thing, I think I call it Watchtower or something like that. It also is really kind of cool because your two-factor authentication with the Authenticator app, the one that lasts for 60 seconds, that's built into 1Password. So that's really cool. Obviously, it costs money for that one. There is another one that I've been looking at, and many of my security friends are recommending it, called Bitdefender. I believe that's what it's called. Bitwarden, that's what it is, Bitwarden. And that one's open source and much less expensive. I highly recommend looking at that. LastPass is also another one that I know many people use, and that is really cool. And then I see the best password generator that you would recommend. Another great tool within 1Password is that they will suggest passwords for you. And then there's a bunch of websites where you can just, go get a suggested password. I never use them totally. I always add additional, make it my own, just add random characters throughout. Try to use a password that's like 12 characters or more. But if you're using a password manager, it'll auto suggest a password for you. So I would definitely use that. There are tons of great security plugins out there. It depends on what you're trying to do. I highly recommend Cloudflare. Just use the free Cloudflare because it's so good to have that CDN aspect of it where you're actually making your website more performant for end users, no matter where they are in the world, because you're using a content delivery network. And they also block a lot of those really generic attacks. So that really helps. There's a ton of great plugins that are out there. Sakuri, iThemes, and WordFonts are all really good ones. It really depends on what you're using and what you're trying to do. I am partial to iThemes, and I've been using that recently just because of that new passkeys feature that's launching in the next couple of weeks. This is going to be a game changer, and it's really going to kill passwords. So I'm excited with the innovation that this is bringing to WordPress. So I would definitely take a look at iTheme security because of WebAuthn. Or passkeys is basically allowing you to use biometrics. So if you have a MacBook and you've got the fingerprint and it logs you into your computer or shows you your passwords that you have stored in Safari, or if you need to log into the Apple Store, that biometric login is using WebAuthn on the Apple Store. And to have that capability added to WordPress is truly a game changer. So I highly recommend looking at that because it's going to kill passwords eventually. And that is great. Are password generators that come with browsers okay? This is where eggs in one basket type of situation. I use them. I am not going to say I use them for Safari, just for a few things. I don't use them for my bank accounts. I don't use them for anything that's super sensitive. I don't use them for my email account because once somebody takes over your email account, they get access to so many different things. All they have to do is password reset routines, and your email account is basically central to doing a lot of those password resets, right? So certain things I only use Password Manager for. You know, if I'm going to log into, what do I use it for? Like Amazon, shopping. You want to buy something on my account? That's fine. Whatever, send it to me, whatever is interesting to you. Amazon, I'm not so concerned with, so I do use my browser for that. But here's the deal. If you have a laptop and any chance whatsoever you're working in a coffee shop and you have to go to the bathroom just for a second, it's going to be okay. Stacy over at the checkout is going to watch it for me, whatever. And your laptop gets lifted and it's unlocked. They now have access to your browser, and they now have access to logging in. As long as you have biometrics set up, you're probably going to be okay. But is that a risk that you're willing to take? So just be very judicious with using that. There have also been, if you're using Chrome, there have been a number of Chrome vulnerabilities over the last couple of years. Not so much this year, but last year there was like just a flurry of Chrome vulnerabilities. So make sure if you are storing passwords in your browser that you're keeping your browser up to date, because browsers can have vulnerabilities and can have bugs. So if wherever you're storing your passwords needs to be secure. The more important the password is, you know, you're going to want to be more secure. Security is a scale, right? The least secure thing is open to everyone. The most secure thing on the deepest end of security is a computer that's encased in cement and buried 6 feet underground in the backyard and nobody can access it. Pretty secure. It's not even on the internet, right? So where is that thing that you're trying to secure on that scale? Do you want it to be super open, or do you want it to be tightened completely and totally so it's almost encased in cement, or do you want it somewhere in between? And for every site you're working with, whether it's WordPress or your bank account, it's going to fall differently on that scale. If you have a site that's just a blog, and it gets hacked and it's not that big a deal, maybe you're more lenient and it's just you logging in. But if it's something that's got all of your customer data and it's your WooCommerce storefront and that's critical to your income and being able to provide for your family, you better have that secured, and you better be making the most judicious, conscious security decisions for that kind of asset, because it's putting food on the table, right? So only you can make those types of decisions on that sort of continuum of security for each one of your assets. But just be mindful of everything every decision you're making.
Great, thank you, Kathy. Kathy, I have another question. You can with WordPress, you can connect to the Instagram account, for example, with a plugin or something.
Yeah.
It is possible to hack the Instagram account through WordPress.
What account?
Is Instagram
Instagram
account.
Instagram.
It is possible to hack.
Instagram is like super targeted by hackers, because it's once they take over an account, it's really hard to get it back. And there's a lot you can do with it in terms of just like phishing and targeting all of your friends, those types of things. I see a lot of people talking about Instagram security. If you have Instagram, let's say you have a plugin that's just pulling from Instagram and it's on your WordPress account, you're probably not going to have a problem. I would just worry about, Instagram isn't going to obviously, if somebody hacks your Instagram account and you have pictures being pulled from Instagram on a feed, those pictures and those, they'll put like scammy Ray-Ban pictures and things like that on an Instagram account that's hacked, that'll show up on your WordPress site. So those types of things, but I don't think anyone's going to get into your WordPress WP admin that way. But again, it does kind of highlight something that that's really important with pulling in services. You have your WordPress site and you want to automate things as much as possible. And let's say you are connecting to SVG files that are hosted elsewhere, hosted on a different server, and somebody else has control of that, and you're pulling those into your site. SVG files have some security issues because you can put code and things. It's not like compressed like a JPEG or something like that. So if you are pulling content, whether it's from a feed or it's an image, something like that, and it's coming from someplace other than your self-hosted WordPress site, be very judicious and careful with those types of things. Try not to, pull things from other sites.
Thank you, Kathy. I don't see more questions. So I think we can finish the webinar, and thank you again, Kathy, for sharing with us your experience about security, and see you in the next webinar.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, everyone, and see you in the next weeks. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.